Since this year's chapel theme is on holy places, I thought it would be appropriate to draw attention to one of the holiest places on earth. At least Christians in the 4th century thought that this was one of the holiest places on earth, and that was the desert. More specifically, the deserts of Roman-occupied Egypt, Palestine, and Syria. Now, what was so special about the desert? It was the place of spiritual giants. The veritable rock stars of the Christian faith in the 4th century came from the desert. They were the heroes. They were the ones who would have a reality show made about them if it were possible at the time. People read of their exploits. People heard of their stories and traveled from all across the empire and from outside of the empire to be in the presence of these men and women. No doubt some just wanting to satisfy their curiosity. They heard about these amazing, crazy people. But others traveled thousands of kilometers to learn of a better way to live the Christian faith. Even emperors wrote them for their advice. What they had, others wanted. So many wanted it, in fact, that tens of thousands of followers moved into the desert to live among these desert fathers and mothers, to travel in the footsteps of these famous heroes of the faith. What they were craving, what those people were craving was what I've coined desert spirituality. At one time, desert spirituality was considered to be the perfect expression of Christian values, the ideal way of living the Christian life. Those living desert values were the ones deemed to be actually following the commands of Christ and striving in His way without any compromise. Desert values were promoted in numerous written works that were copied and then widely circulated throughout the ancient world. And there are a number of key figures. One, of course, is St. Anthony. He was the most famous of the desert fathers. And he was no one-hit wonder. He was famous for centuries, and actually he's still famous this day. And there was an immensely popular work of hagiography written about him called The Life of Anthony. And it was on the bestseller list for centuries and influenced millions of lives. Just the reading of his biography, which I would encourage you to read, just the reading of his biography in the 4th century led to the conversion of many people. And the most influential theologian of all times, St. Augustine, was moved towards conversion through the reading of the life of Anthony. He grew up in an Egyptian family, grew up in a Christian home. His parents died when he was around 20. He was left to look after the estate after his parents died and look after his younger sister. Around 6 months later, he was walking to church and thinking about the passage in Acts 4 that described early Christians selling all their possessions and giving everything to the poor. And when he got to church, he heard the preacher reading from Matthew 19:21. If you would be perfect, go and sell everything you have and give it to the poor and come follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven. So what did he do? That's what he did. It's exactly what he did. He put his sister in the care of a convent, and then he sold or gave away all of his possessions. He gave away everything, and off he went to live in a town in the desert. He lived in seclusion. He eventually kept moving away from people. He gave up bathing. He wore animal skins, the rough part on the inside, not on the outside. He ate little, usually just bread, salt, and water. Eventually, he had a friend seal him in a tomb, just for 20 years or so. Years later, he moved into a ruined fort, and many sought him out for counsel. People traveled from all over to come and hear the wisdom of St. Anthony. But the crowds kept getting larger, so he eventually moved into the mountains. He kept moving away and away and away. But his fame kept growing and growing. But he became a giant. He was one of the rock stars of the 4th century. But it's not just a male movement. You have many. In fact, in some communities, there were more women than men in these monastic communities. Syncletica of Alexandria, Saint Syncletica. Again, wealthy background. After her parents' death, she gave all her money to the poor, entered into a life of asceticism, which is a life of extreme discipline, into a life of asceticism along with her younger sister. And she lived in a crypt or a tomb outside of Alexandria as a hermit. So she lived where people were buried, and she lived there, and she became very famous and inspired others to enter into a life and gathered a following. And so this is a movement of famous people. These were spiritual giants, and I can see on the look of some of your faces, so this is kind of an odd world to live in, but these were those who were deemed to have been following the commands of Christ perfectly. Well, were they crazy? Well, how do you live as a disciple of Jesus? Think about it for a moment. Those in the desert believed that they were living the way of life taught by Jesus. They were living it literally. They were living it perfectly. Now, it's easy for us to dismiss these hairy and smelly men and women as crazy and to write them off as irrelevant and even dangerous kooks. However, think about it for a moment. Jesus said, okay, here's your checklist. Consider this. Checklist. What is the ideal disciple like? Checklist. Jesus said in Matthew 19 that there were those who were eunuchs for the kingdom. Check. Got that. They lived a life of celibacy. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 7, it would be best if people did not marry. Well, these people didn't marry. Check. Jesus stated in the Sermon on the Mount that he expected his followers to fast. Check. They did so big time. They fasted. Jesus said in Matthew 19 to give away everything that you have to be perfect. Well, check. They did that. The desert played an important role in the life of Jesus and in the life of John, as it did in theirs. Check. In 1 Corinthians 9:27, Paul said he disciplined his body to bring it under control. Those in the desert did so likewise. Check. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5:17 to pray without ceasing. That's their life. Check. Over and over again, they believed that they were the ones who were following the commands of Christ perfectly, following the literal commands of Jesus and Paul and the teaching in the New Testament. But was theirs the ideal way of living the gospel? That's how it was understood, and that's how many today actually still understand it. Well, we have to be discerning. We need to separate the wheat from the chaff. And my aim this morning is not to critique the birth and then growth and existence of monasticism. My critique here is not, or my presentation is not to critique, but it's to simply see what can we appropriate from this movement. What can we appropriate from monasticism? There have been lots of people who have tried to do this. Of course, Protestants usually get, monasticism, that's what Catholics do, we can't do that. And so there's this reaction, this is not what we do. But Protestants in the last few decades have been trying to appropriate from the world of monasticism what they can live, what can be learned from the life of Benedict. So we have the Benedict option. There's new monasticism. What can we appropriate from the desert monks? And so that's what I want us to do this morning is to learn from this movement, to learn from these rock stars, to learn from these famous people, and see what they can speak into our lives today in the 21st century. We're not in the desert. Look outside. We're not in the desert. But what can we learn from these people in the 21st century? And I have four things that we can appropriate. I think there's much more, but for the sake of time, I'll look at four and go quickly through these points. So first of all, desert spirituality. I think pretty obvious. We need to be disciplined in terms of learning from these characters. I remember in Bible college back in the fall of 85, I started Bible college, and I found out I had to take a mandatory English literature course over the 4 years that I was there. And I put it off my first year, second year, third year, and the fourth year I found out I can't put it off any longer. I have to take a literature course. All I wanted to take was Bible and theology, and especially church history. That's what I wanted to take. But no, I had to take this English literature course. So I took John Milton's Paradise Lost. Well, I loved the class. I'd never read Milton's Paradise Lost. Took a few weeks to get into the temple and how the text is written. But I loved it. And there's this scene in Paradise Lost where Satan and his minions have been cast from heaven and they're down in hell. And of course, Satan's minions are all complaining, and it looks like there might be a revolt against Satan because he's got them cast out of heaven. And Satan says these famous words of consolation: it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And when I read that, just like, wow, that so captures our ethos as people in relationship to wanting to do things our own way. Not submit. I will not submit. I will not serve. I will not deny myself anything. Not power, not wealth, not comfort, not my will. And that's the attitude of Satan as he's cast out. But it's better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. We live in a culture that is all about me, self-actualization, society that in many ways forms its values found in the words and convictions of the devil in exile. Deny dreams, deny comfort, deny wealth, deny my plans, deny my career, deny my goals. No, are you out of your mind? Self-denial is not a virtue. In fact, it should be labeled as psychosis in some people's opinions. Why would you deny yourself anything? Self-denial is out, self-actualization is in. At the heart of desert values, however, desert spirituality is self-denial. Think about it. There are the three classical things that you vow when you go into a life of monasticism. What are they? Poverty, chastity, and obedience. Right? Those are the three central vows that you make to enter into this way of life. Poverty, chastity, obedience. Think about it. Poverty gets at or undermines our materialism. Chastity, our immorality. And obedience, our hedonism. Each one of those vows is a vow of self-denial. To deny oneself something. At the core of desert spirituality is a life of discipline. And denying oneself is at the core of any spiritual discipline. For as the desert fathers and mothers would have argued, unbridled passions could easily and quickly derail one's spiritual life. It is important to get this right because sometimes they got it wrong and sometimes we get it wrong. Self-denial is not self-hatred, self-loathing, self-abasement, self-mutilation, self-destruction. That's not what it's supposed to be. Self-denial, as it was understood, ideally, is about taking Jesus seriously. When he says, in Mark 8, those who would come after me or follow me must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Or, Matthew 19, if you would be perfect, go and sell everything you have, give it to the poor, come follow me, and you will have treasure in heaven. Well, a part of self-denial, a life of discipline. And remember, the life of being one of these monks or nuns in the desert is a life of discipline and self-denial. It's a life of unceasing prayer, hourly prayer, meditation. And I don't have time to go into that point, but it's a life that revolved around a life of praying and seeking after God and His power and His wisdom and His guidance in life. Fasting, remember, this is desert spirituality, not dessert spirituality, so all that kind of stuff is out, all right? Good meals are out. Gratification of one's desires, just the difference of one letter, right? What a huge difference in terms of spirituality. It's not dessert spirituality, it's desert spirituality. Fasting, just a regular part of the routine. And if you look at their life, what they ate, you just wonder, like, how on earth did they even survive on what little they ate? But the point is, it's unbridled passions will derail your spirituality. There must be acts of self-denial. And I speak as a Baptist, and I could probably count on 2 or 3 fingers the services that I've heard on the importance of fasting. We talk about we're a biblical people. The Bible's filled with fasting. We never practice it. We never talk about it. We don't do it. And so the desert fathers and mothers knew that fasting should be a regular part of one's spiritual life. And so to absorb and incorporate and appropriate the life of desert spirituality is self-denial, unceasing prayer, fasting, Bible study, and meditation. Simple and childlike approach to Scripture is what marked their lives. They took these passages literally, even the hard passages, and the memorization of Scripture was critical. There was one monk who was reported to have memorized the entire Old Testament, the entire New Testament, and thousands of pages of the Church Fathers. Right? That's what they did. They memorized. Now, not everybody memorized all that, but the point is that was the goal. And the goal was not speculative theology. The goal was to become like Jesus. You memorize Scripture to meditate and be transformed and shaped, not just so you could spout off some doctrines. As important as doctrines are. Holy living, finally. Ever vigilant for the danger of sin creeping into their lives. So there's this account of one, I think it might be Anthony, but it might be Benedict, but I think it's Anthony. But anyway, so they're in the desert. He's thinking back to his pre-Christian life, and he's getting these lustful thoughts of women in his life. And so he's perplexed what to do, and he sees this pile of thorn bushes growing, and he rips off his clothing, runs over, jumps on the thorns, and rolls around in the thorns naked, and comes out, lust is gone, and then carries on. Right? Now that's not MDC approved. Okay, that way of going. Okay, so, and nobody, who in their right minds would recommend that as a way of dealing with lust and struggles with thoughts? But it worked for him. But what does it represent? It represents an incredible desire to be holy. And how far will you go to be holy? And they were willing to pay the price. Now again, that's a pretty extreme example, but it's a life of discipline. And to be disciplined requires taking radical steps. So, be disciplined. 2, recognize the reality of spiritual warfare. Accounts of Anthony's battles with demons are quite wild and crazy. And this is a picture, these are 2 pictures that represent Anthony. Here's Anthony in the middle, and there are all these demons around him, attacking him and gnawing at him, pulling at him, and attacking him. And these accounts of the Desert Fathers are filled with descriptions of spiritual battles being waged. Now, some argue that those accounts are the result of hallucinations due to deprivation, nightmares. But the reality is there's accounts just filled with descriptions of physical battles being waged. People reported hearing conversation, shrieking, crying, wailing, and so on and so forth, and people crashing around. And the argument would be that these accounts mirror the experience of Jesus in the desert. Because when Jesus was in the desert, who confronted him? Satan, right? So the desert is a place of spiritual warfare. You go into the desert to wage war against Satan and his minions. And so it's to learn from spiritual or the desert values is to recognize the reality of spiritual warfare. There's one really powerful statement in the life of Anthony. It talks about how, and I think I've given it in your bulletin, but it may not be there. But the idea that Satan will attack you in a day, and if he can't be successful against you in a day because you're so, disciplined and hardened to his attacks, then he'll get you in your dreams. And so what you need to do is also pray before you go to sleep that God will protect you in your dreams. Wow, that is profound wisdom. And how true is that, right? It's very true. And so before I go to bed, when I remember, I always try to pray, protect my dreams, my wife's dreams, my children's dreams. Watch out for us in the day and watch out for us at night. Because even sleeping, you're not safe. They're not talking about becoming super paranoid, but they're saying there's a reality there. 3rd, seek others for discernment. I got to speed up a bit because of time. This requires humility, because, especially in a context like this, because we all think we're really smart here. Yeah, we are, of course. No, we all think we're really smart here, and so it's very difficult to seek others for discernment. But humility is at the core of desert spirituality. When one novice asked a more experienced monk about a question, he was told, "Go and join a man who fears God and live near him. He will teach you too to fear God." Desert fathers and mothers knew enough to surround themselves with wise and godly people. Not flashy people, but godly people. And the older and the wiser, the better. It was a matter of life and death as well. One comment, "I know of no fall that happens to a monk that does not come from trusting his own judgment. Do you know someone who has fallen? Be sure that he directed himself. Nothing is more grievous than to be one's own director. Nothing is more pernicious." And so a posture of humility, to seek others' wisdom, to seek others for discernment. And 4th and finally, be wise about engaging culture. Many people flocked into the desert to escape temptation and corruption. Monks and nuns kept going further and further and further into the desert to escape the many people who wanted to see them alive or in their company. And of course, you know that would be a very hard temptation to resist. People traveling, you traveled 1,000 kilometers to hear me. What does that do to one's ego? Well, these people are supposed to be about humility, and yet everything about the response to their godliness works against their humility. So what do? They go away and they hide even further, and more people follow them and they go further. And so they're continually fleeing. They're seeking to avoid the sins of civilization and the temptations and the traps of civilization. Now, they did not have Netflix or the internet or social media to consume and corrupt their soul, but they had the same temptations. They didn't have the same technology, but the temptations were there. And the way that they tried to avoid them was to flee those temptations. Now today we can be leery of disengaging culture for fear of being legalistic or rigid fundamentalists. We don't want to be like that. Or we want to be missional and be right there in the midst of things. Yet there's a wisdom in disengaging from culture, properly understood. And we can learn from their example to disengage. And finally, in conclusion, let me just say something about desert spirituality. I was on a keep calm look for stuff, so there's lots of stuff out there. It's good. Thomas Merton. It would perhaps be too much to say that the world needs another movement such as that which drew these men and women into the deserts of Egypt and Palestine. He wrote that in his Wisdom of the Desert. And there are lots of books on the wisdom of the desert, and you can read Fathers of the Desert, Mothers of the Desert, and lots of sources. And here's where it's counterintuitive. You think, I just talked about, be wise and engaging culture, maybe disengage culture. It's counterintuitive because despite their best attempts at isolation, desert monks and nuns were drawn into the issues of the church. In fact, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, basically they choose their leaders from the monastic movement because they know they're getting the cream of the crop from those movements. And so here you go into these communities to escape the traps and temptations of life, and yet it's that very godly impulse that makes you an appealing candidate for leadership, and then they just pull you back in again. And there's one account of one or two monks who actually disfigure themselves. They cut parts of their bodies off to avoid being chosen into becoming a bishop because they wanted to stay a monk. Now, what would that mean? Well, if you dismembered yourself, it meant you were unqualified for leadership. And so they discouraged that. And so that one way to not become a bishop is to chop a piece of my body off. And so they did. Now, you say, well, that's not MDC approved. Of course it's not, but it tells you something about their impulse, their desire, their heart, right? But there's something counterintuitive. They're drawn back in. Constant visitors would come. Doctrinal disputes were brought to them for their word. Remember, if anyone had, the Bible on a hard drive, it was the monks. And, what about this doctrine, especially Arianism in the 4th century? Well, what about this? What about that? Well, this passage, and they can do this kind of theological, biblical thinking. And even emperors would write. Imagine getting a letter from the Roman emperor seeking wisdom on an issue. That would be something that would, put on your CV. In the centuries that followed, the 4th century, consider this. This is a counterintuitive part of it, and with this I'll close. Some of the best work in the church and society was by those who came out of isolation to bring reform or change or assistance. Think about it. The monks and the nuns, for the next 1,000 years, you'd be hard-pressed to find a missionary of the church, a theologian of the church, a historian of the church, or a reformer of the church who does not come out of a religious order, who does not come out of this movement. This is a critical movement in charting the trajectory of the church. This movement kept Roman and Greek civilization, literature, and scholarship alive. They gave a refuge for outcasts of society. They gave opportunity for women to serve. They helped to clear land, make roads, drain marshes, improve seeds and breeds of livestock, and experiment with better agricultural techniques. They did it all. An absolutely critical movement coming out of this desert spirituality. And so my prayer, in conclusion, my prayer today is that each one of us make a journey to the desert and be mentored and inspired by these godly men and women. Thank you.